proposal. During a time when states, institutions, parents, and students are worried about ways to increase college affordability, I think it would be better for states to put their limited resources toward helping colleges and universities keep their tuition down rather than adding another layer of state bureaucracy. For these reasons and others, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona.
Yeah, and if I may, let me yield to the ranking member of the Education Committee.
I thank the gentleman yielding. Just quickly, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, a lot of states are already doing this, but now we don't want to add a burden. This simply says the state has to have a process. The state has a process, it's over. It's done. And so why would we take away? Why would we take away that voice in those states that don't have a process? Let's make sure the students have a place to go. As we know, many of these financial scandals have been brought to us by students because they can't get redress anywhere else. And I thank the gentleman for yielding. I urge I vote on his amendment.
Gentleman reserve.
Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
I'll reserve, Madam Chairman.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Arizona, pardon me.
Thank you. The underlying legislation, H.R. 2117, stacks the deck against the due process and the ability for families and students to seek redress when institutions or programs deny them or mistreat them regarding the services that they're purchasing and the education that they're seeking. By reinserting that provision, we allow families and students to have redress, to have due process, and to have a fair and balanced look at complaints they might have. It is simple, it is direct, and it merits remaining in the legislation. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back to Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'll say once again, I believe this is unnecessary, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. Oppose the amendment.
Gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from Arizona.
On that, I would ask for a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the
Yes.
Go into Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina rise?
Madam Chairman, I offer an amendment.
It's the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 112-404, offered by Ms. Foxx of North Carolina.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 563, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Foxx, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment to H.R. 2117, the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act. In the months since the Education and Workforce Committee approved H.R. 2117, states and institutions have expressed concerns about interpretations of the clock hour provisions in the credit hour regulation. The regulation would prevent some programs from converting to a credit hour program, even though the conversion is permitted under state law. This change could alter the manner in which colleges and universities disperse federal student aid and harm students' ability to progress efficiently in their coursework. My amendment will prevent the federal government from reinterpreting a state's laws or regulations to require credit hour programs to convert back to clock hour programs. A state should be the final judge of its own laws and regulations. This is a necessary step to correct the Department of Education's interpretation of a clock hour program and will reaffirm our intent that discretion for determining clock hour programs should remain with states, accrediting agencies, and institutions. Madam Chairman, the amendment improves the underlying legislation and ensures colleges and students are protected from a harmful federal intrusion into academic affairs. I urge my colleagues to lend their support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California rise in opposition.
Yes, I do.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentlewoman. This amendment is absolutely consistent with this legislation. What it does is just simply make it easier for any institution to maximize the amount of federal aid they get Under this amendment, they would be able to choose whether or not they want to be a clock hour or a credit hour institution, and that would depend really on how they could game the reimbursement that's available to them, again, without checking whether or not this provision allows for the student to receive value for that money which they borrowed to pay for their education. I oppose this amendment. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
I yield back the balance of my time, urging my colleagues to support the amendment.
Gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 3, printed in House Report 112-404. For what purpose does the California? For what purpose, gentleman from Colorado?
Thank you. I have an amendment at the desk. This will be Amendment 5.
Clerk will designate the amendment. Oh, it is now in order to consider amendment number 3.
Oh, okay. I will then I have an amendment at the desk. The amendment is number 3.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 112-404, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 563, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Congress should be the taxpayer's advocate to root out waste, fraud, and abuse wherever it occurs. And this is particularly true when it comes to student financial aid. Both of my amendments pertain to this category of making sure we have the right structure in place to, in one case, incentivize, and in another case, have a strategy to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. Every dollar we lose to fraud and waste is a dollar that's not invested in our young people, a dollar of deficit spending, of government spending, that is not producing the desired outcome of education in our youth, preparation of our workforce for jobs in the 21st century, and improving our economic strength. If we're eliminating some of the basic protections that are categorically applied under the bill, it's very important that we require that institutions that are failing students to prove their value. If schools have a chronically low graduation rate, a low completion rate, or a high loan default rate, then in fact they should be required to be recognized by the state in which they're operating as a backstop against fraud, waste, and abuse to ensure that the students' complaints and questions are at least heard by their own state if they believe that they've been treated unfairly or unjustly by a college or university. That's what my amendment would do. It would provide an incentive for colleges and universities to produce better outcome for students. I'm going to, in both of my remarks, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Carnegie units and how we determine time. Frankly, this bill is a very limited piece. What we need to do more broadly when we reauthorize Higher Education Act is really look at outcome-based measurements for learning in higher education. I think the Secretary, with his rules regarding gainful employment, provided some useful indicators around outcome-based measurements. There are many others that we should look at, but part of what we need to accomplish is freeing good-performing institutions up from the input restraints, the input barriers. If they can effectively teach something that normally takes 2 hours in 5 minutes, that institution should be rewarded for that and encouraged to do that. What a great way to invest our taxpayer money in some innovative institution of higher education that has figured out how to get 2 hours of legacy Carnegie credit into 5 minutes of rapid instruction. What a wonderful accomplishment, and I'm hopeful that that and more can be accomplished. My amendment would provide an incentive for colleges and universities to produce better outcomes. Where they're not performing, they would be subject to their state. Where they are performing, they'd have the additional flexibility under this Act. And I think that that's something we should encourage in higher education, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from North Carolina. Does the gentlewoman rise in opposition?
I rise in opposition, Madam Chairman.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This amendment is simply unnecessary, and I oppose it. Since the day the President took office, members of his administration have been issuing one heavy-handed regulation after another, primarily in the name of program integrity. However, the regulations simply bring increased federal intrusion into all aspects of our lives and do not provide the kind of accountability that we need to have throughout our federal government. Therefore, I oppose it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In what other government program would we somehow say it's all right to keep funneling taxpayer money without accountability? Specifically, my amendment would retain state authorization requirements for institutions that have below-average graduation rates, below-average annual completion rates, and above-average loan default rates, and free up the good-performing institutions to experiment and not hold them accountable to the Carnegie units that continue to reach out and prevent innovation in the education sector. I believe the regulations are reasonable and a relatively low burden on colleges. I think by providing this incentive, we can make sure that universities and institutions of higher education that are good custodians of our public dollars are freed up to engage in the kind of innovation that can produce a 21st century workforce and drive education innovation into the new century. And those that continue to have below average graduation rates, completion rates, and high default rates will make sure that there is a recourse with their states for those institutions. I strongly urge a yes vote on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Again, I want to state my opposition to this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is gentleman from Colorado.
I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 5.
Does the gentleman request a recorded vote on amendment number 3?
No.
The amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in House Report 112-404. For what purpose is the gentleman from Colorado?
I have an amendment at the desk. It's amendment number 5.
Amendment number 4 is in order at this point.
The gentleman, would the gentleman be speaking on amendment number 4, which is the amendment that is in order at this moment?
I'll ask you to, did you want to go? Is that your amendment 4? Okay. Yeah, I can, are you for that? Is that yours?
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 112-404, offered by Mr. Bishop of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 563, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop, and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. This amendment simply strips the language from the underlying bill that permanently constrains the Secretary from promulgating a regulation or a rule that defines a credit hour. Permanently constrains the Secretary from promulgating a regulation or a rule. And I would suggest that this would represent very, very poor public policy. We provide over $200 billion in federal student aid, either in the form of grants or in the form of guarantees, and the basis, at least in part, on which we provide that is students' adherence to the minimum number of credit hours that they must take, and institutions' adherence to that which they define as a credit hour. We have no idea what's going to happen 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now with respect to whether institutions will be in compliance. We have no idea whether or not shortcuts will be taken. We have no idea, with the ongoing proliferation of online instruction and other non-traditional means of instruction, whether or not we will be dealing with a higher education universe that is maintaining the appropriate quality controls and maintaining the appropriate protections against the kind of abuse that would ensue if students are able to take courses where the credit hour is not as demanding as reasonable people would suggest that it would be, where the semester might be shorter as a result of lack of adherence to what a reasonable definition of a credit hour is, and to put the Secretary of Education in the position where he or she would be unable to act in that circumstance is simply unwise, and to impose on the Congress the responsibility to fix a situation that could be much more easily fixed by regulatory or administrative action is also unwise. So this is very straightforward, it's very simple, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from North Carolina. Does the gentlewoman rise in opposition?
Yes, Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, the creation of a federal definition of credit hour is a prime example of federal overreach into an area that should be left to colleges and universities. This has worked from the beginning of our country. Our accrediting bodies, our colleges and universities have done their jobs. There have been no complaints about this. There was one minor episode that occurred, one isolated event, and it was addressed through the accrediting body. This is a typical example of the overreach of this administration, and particularly the Department of Education. If a need arose in the future to create a federal definition or put some additional parameters around this section of the law, then it should be done through the legislative process, where the implications of such a definition can be thoroughly examined. Madam Speaker, the founders were very, very wise when they created the Constitution. They delineated exactly what the federal government should and should not be doing. The word education is no place in the Constitution. But Article 1, Section 1 does talk about the House of Representatives and the Congress. That's where the founders wanted the power to lie, where the authority to lie. We are accountable to the people who represent us. We're the people's house. We should not be abrogating our responsibility to unelected bureaucrats. And I'm almost embarrassed that any member would want to do that. We need this responsibility. We have the time to take care of it if there is such a need. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
I would simply point out that my friend from North Carolina continues to use words like intrusion and overreach, and yet a few moments ago, in response to comments I had made during general debate, she said that as an academic dean, the gentlelady was able to exercise discretion and define a credit hour and define a course and define a semester. There is absolutely nothing in the regulation that the Department of Education has promulgated that would prevent the gentlelady or someone in her position from continuing to exercise that discretion, because in the regulation it says that institutionally determined equivalents are perfectly permissible and perfectly acceptable. And so the discretion that the gentlelady quite correctly utilized while she was a dean remains in the toolbox of every college administrator in this country. And so I would urge defeat of the underlying bill. I would urge passage of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The gentleman is correct. Deans and assistant deans and others in universities and colleges have that authority right now. They've had it since the beginning of the creation of institutions of higher education, and we don't need the federal government meddling in business in places it has no business meddling. And I oppose the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from New
May I
York.
request the yeas and nays?
Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
Ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in House Report 112-404. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment Number 5.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 5, printed in House Report Number 112-404, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 563, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that the gentlelady from North Carolina has put together a good bill. It has some good parts and some bad parts. I'm very hopeful that she will accept this amendment. I believe that the intent of the bill, specifically around making sure that we don't have an overarching implementation of Carnegie units. And again, where does this stem from? It stems from a U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General report that found that there's not an established definition of credit hour or minimum requirement. The Secretary, working within those constraints, tried to provide a definition. I don't think that's a productive road to go down. So I strongly support the general thrust of this bill. But where we need to move is towards outcome-based measurements. We have this same discussion in K-12 education as well. And the conclusion that I've come to, and I come to the same conclusion in higher education, is we need to free institutions up with regard to the inputs to promote innovation and make sure that we hold institutions accountable for the outputs where taxpayer money is at stake. One component of the bill that I hope that the gentlelady from North Carolina can work with me on in accepting this amendment, and I think it's a very pragmatic and a piece of an amendment that would improve the bill, is it would, since we are removing many of the specifics that currently combat waste, fraud, and abuse, again, and I don't think we want to combat waste, fraud, and abuse by applying an overly rigid hour is an hour standard with no wriggle room, because what we care about is whether kids are learning, not whether they spend 5 minutes or 2 hours doing it. I've talked to folks who use apprenticeships, who use online education, and we should hold them accountable for results where there's taxpayer money at hand. But at the same time, we want to make sure that there is a backstop for what I think people on both sides agree exists, which is waste, fraud, and abuse in the system. What my amendment would do is replace the specifics of these regulations with a directive to the Department of Education to come up with an alternative plan that protects taxpayer dollars and students' rights. This would make sure that we can deal with many of the issues raised by the Inspector General, not by providing an overly arching and rigid definition of time that's a necessary part of education, but rather by requesting and requiring that the Secretary come up with ideas that are consistent with the future of education towards combating waste, fraud, and abuse. I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I appreciate the very positive comments that my colleague from Colorado has made about the underlying bill, and I hope very much that he will support it. And I appreciate actually serving with him on the Rules Committee and the often common sense approaches that he brings to legislation that we're reviewing. However, I have to say reluctantly that I am opposing his amendment. I don't think, again, that we need to ask the Department of Education to present more plans or more rules and regulations. It is certainly doing a lot to present rules and regulations that are totally unnecessary. Next year we will have the reauthorization of the higher education bill. As I think most people know, the Speaker has asked all the committees, all the subcommittees to exercise their oversight responsibilities, and we are certainly doing that and will continue to do that. And therefore, I think that the gentleman from Colorado's amendment is unnecessary, and I oppose it. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that, again, my amendment would provide sufficient flexibility to accommodate alternative higher education settings. The reason we're talking about rules and preventing fraud, waste, and abuse is not somehow the government is going someplace that's unwarranted. These are federal student loans. These are federal programs we're talking about. We do not want taxpayers to be ripped off. We do not want students to be ripped off. I believe that directing the Secretary to come up with an alternative plan to the one we're stripping out would go a long way towards accomplishing that. I agree with the gentleman from North Carolina. Fundamentally, many of these issues need to be discussed during the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and I hope that she will join me at that point, yes, on freeing up the input-based measurements, but equally, if not more as important, making sure that we hold the recipients of taxpayer-funded programs accountable for the outcomes. And there is no perfect outcome-based measurement. We know this from K-12 education as well. But even a mediocre one is better than none. And I think it will fall upon this Congress to do that. I think that this bill facilitates that discussion. But should it become law, I would certainly hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle can join me in supporting this common-sense directive to ensure that waste, fraud, and abuse do not enter the system, along with freeing up innovation and thoughtful new ways to educate kids. I urge my colleagues to join me on voting yes on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Again, I appreciate the sentiments of my colleague from Colorado, but I would say to him that there is absolutely nothing to prevent the Secretary of Education from coming to the Education Committee and presenting his ideas on where there is waste, fraud, and abuse. We would be more than happy to do that. Most of what we hear from the administration is spend, 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 not how can we save money, but spend, spend, spend. All of us want to make sure that every dime of taxpayers' money is well spent, and I can assure you that members of my committee want to see that the money is well spent, and we'll be working on that issue as we have been working on it, as will all the Republican majorities in the Congress, in the House, do that. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time and urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment.
Gentlewoman's time has yielded back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. (2117) directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House of the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2117 and has come to no resolution thereon. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the House will stand in recess subject to the call of the Chair.
The House has wrapped up debate, general debate, and amendment debate on a bill that would